her sweet, delicate sister looked her in the eye and said, "He was never really yours." Caroline thought she won the prize, parading the stolen boyfriend like a trophy. But the smirk wipes off her face instantly when she sees who her sister brought to the gala. He's 6'3", sharp-jawed and holding her waist while the whole room stares. Karma arrives in a custom-tailored suit. Listen closely to the quiet static of the night. Tonight, you and I are going to unpack a story about a ghost walking back into the world of the living. Just 3 weeks ago, Arya Vale was nothing to these people. A punchline whispered behind expensive, manicured hands. Her boyfriend didn't merely walk away. He shattered her by choosing her own sister right. At a family dinner, they fully expected her to crumble quietly into the shadows. But look at her now tonight. She steps into the Whitmore Gala anchored to Luca Darrow, a man whose mere name makes billionaires sweat cold. We are going to watch a broken soul become completely untouchable. Stick with me through the dark hours. Because the truth is, sometimes the deepest wounds teach us how to forge the strongest armor. The chandelier suspended above the ballroom weighed 4 tons and cost an absolute fortune. Arya knew this because she used to exist here as a mere shadow. Back then, she was just a convenient +1, forcing smiles through hollow conversations about summer homes. While Marcus, her former love, worked the room and left her stranded, that eager-to-please version of herself felt like a distant stranger now tonight. The heavy light catching the crystal felt entirely different. It was no longer warm, it was cold and sharp, glittering fiercely off champagne flutes and the fragile masks of civility these people wore so much better than their tailored clothes. It is a lonely realization when you finally see that the brightest rooms often hold the darkest, emptiest hearts. She stood frozen at the top of the sweeping stairs, her hand resting like a feather on Luca's arm. She refused to cling. She simply existed in that heavy silence, poised as if she owned the night. Luca murmured without turning his head, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the air around them. "You are doing fine." Arya swallowed hard, whispering back that she was not doing anything yet. "Exactly," he replied. "That is the entire point." Below them stretched a vast sea of black tuxedos and silk gowns, a room practically suffocating on its own wealth. Somewhere in that gilded cage, Marcus was watching. She felt his stare like a cold wind on the back of her neck, and now Caroline, her sweet, treacherous sister, was there too. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones who draw it first. Arya felt her jaw tighten until her teeth ached. Softly, he still refused to look at her, his dark eyes scanning the velvet room like a quiet predator choosing a target. "If you tense up, they will smell the fear." "I am not tense," she lied. "You are vibrating," he countered. She exhaled a long, shaky breath and forced her shoulders to drop. He was right, and she hated him for seeing through her armor. They descended the stairs in perfect sync, heads snapped toward them. "You and I both know the type of man." Luca was 6'3", sharp-jawed eyes like midnight water. He was the kind of man who could burn an empire to the ground with a single phone call. Being near someone that powerful is dangerous. But sometimes you need a fire to burn away the rot of the past. And tonight, for reasons buried deep in his own quiet shadows, he had chosen to walk into this fire with her. As their shoes hit the polished floor, a waiter materialized out of thin air. Luca smoothly took 2 crystal glasses, handing one to Arya. "You do not have to drink it," he murmured. "Just hold it. It gives your shaking hands a purpose. I know what champagne is for." She fired back. "Do you?" he asked, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. 11 o'clock. Marcus just saw you." Arya felt her heart slam violently against her ribs. "What does he look like?" she breathed. "Like someone just told him his entire life is over," Luca replied softly. "Life has a funny way of bringing our deepest regrets right to our front door when we least expect it." This was frozen by the polished bar. His glass hovered uselessly in the air, his face pale and twisted into a mask of pure, suffocating panic. It was a beautiful agony to witness. Arya deliberately turned her head away before he could catch his breath. She let her gaze float lazily across the room, treating him like invisible dust on the wall. "How do you feel?" Luca asked, his voice a low hum against the music. "Like my stomach is turning inside out," she admitted. "That is completely normal," he assured her. "You are about to burn down 3 years of history in under 2 hours. I would be worried if you were not terrified." They drifted deeper into the glittering trap, past the hollow faces she once called friends. Realizing who your true friends are is often a very quiet, painful revelation. A woman draped in heavy emerald silk did a sharp double-take, leaning in to whisper venom to her husband. An older silver-haired couple offered Luca a stiff nod, violently pretending they were not dissecting Arya with their eyes. These were the people who had watched Marcus betray her, the ones who knew about Caroline and chose silence. Smile, Luca commanded gently. I am smiling, she shot back. No, you are simply showing your teeth. There is a very real difference, we have all been there. Haven't we, wearing a mask so tight it bruises? Arya softened her jaw, letting her lips curl into a slow, mysterious amusement instead of raw desperation. Better, Luca whispered. Let us make them bleed for it. He steered her toward the high windows, right into the heart of the lion's den. Marcus used to call these elites the absolute core of the city, the gatekeepers who decided if your life mattered. Luca, a man named Robert said, extending a hand, I truly did not expect to see you here. Luca shook it once cold, firm and painfully brief. I do not usually do these charity events. I made an exception. Robert's greedy eyes instantly flicked to Arya, searching for a weakness. This is Arya Vale, Luca stated. He did not introduce her as a date or a desperate guest. He delivered her name like an unmovable fact. When Robert took her hand, Arya felt his worldview recalculating in real time. A sharp-eyed woman leaned in, her voice dripping with poison. Arya Vale. Why does that sound so familiar? True grace is standing firm when the ground beneath you begins to crumble. His editorial work, mostly. Luca lied with a smooth, devastating calm. You have probably seen her name in Vogue. It was a beautiful, bulletproof lie. Arya was a freelancer. But the sharp-eyed suddenly nodded with profound realization. Yes. Of course I thought so. People only see the value you boldly claim for yourself. The conversation washed over them, a blur of mergers and yachts. Arya stood tall, gripping her crystal glass. She played her role perfectly, offering a polite laugh. A slow nod, but never giving them a single word. Silence is incredibly intimidating to people who never stop talking. 10 agonizing minutes later, Luca steered her toward the quiet edge of the ballroom. You did very well, he murmured into the shadows. I barely spoke a word, Arya whispered. Exactly, Luca replied. You let their own minds fill in the blanks, that is where real power lives. Arya took a slow sip of the pale champagne. It tasted incredibly expensive, yet entirely empty. I really do not know how you live like this, she confessed. Practice, he said. She pushed back. That, not a real answer. For the first time all night, Luca turned fully toward her. His dark eyes held no pity, no soft sympathy, only a razor-sharp understanding. Do you want the harsh truth? He asked. I stopped caring the exact second. I realized they are all terrified of being irrelevant. Once you see their fear, the rest is just a tragic play. Let me tell you, when you strip away the glamour, human insecurity looks the exact same on everyone. Arya slowly turned. It was Marcus. He stood a few feet away, nervously shoving his hands into his tailored pockets, failing miserably to look calm. Up close, he looked so much older than the man who had broken her heart. The heavy bags under his eyes spoke of restless, guilty nights. Or perhaps those lines had always been there, hidden behind her blind affection. Marcus, she said. Her voice was terrifyingly steady, as if addressing a stranger. He swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Luca before begging. Can we talk? We are talking, she replied. I mean alone, Marcus pleaded. Luca did not blink. He remained a looming silent wall of dark fabric and deadly consequence. Forgiveness is a beautiful virtue. But setting a hard boundary is an absolute necessity for your own survival. Marcus clenched his jaw. Arya, please, he begged. No, the single word hung in the heavy air between them, sharp and beautifully final. Marcus blinked, stunned. I just wanted, I said no, she repeated. In that fleeting second, she watched his entire ego fracture. He looked hurt, as if he expected her to collapse and grant him the easy closure his guilt demanded. You and I both know that we never owe our peace to the people who destroyed it. Enjoy your evening, Arya whispered, turning her back on him forever. Luca fell into step beside her. They walked on to the stone terrace without a single backward glance, leaving Marcus to drown in the whispers of the room. Out in the cold night air, Arya closed her eyes against the wind, and for the first time in weeks, finally learned how to breathe again. The vast city stretched out below them, golden lights flickering like fallen stars. He looked so small. Arya murmured into the wind. Good, Luca replied softly. Let him sit with that empty feeling. They stood side by side in the profound silence behind the glass. The shallow gala raged on with empty laughter and the clinking of silver, but out here there was only the cold sky. Can I ask you something? Arya asked, searching his face. Why are you really doing this for me? Luca leaned heavily against the stone railing. Because I know exactly what it feels like, he confessed, his voice thick with an old, unhealed sorrow, to be entirely underestimated by the people you trusted most. Never let the world convince you that you are small, just because they lack the courage to see your true height. Welcome back, night owls. So let's sink into the tension of the ballroom together. Arya looked at Luca, looking past the sharp lines of his tailored suit. Beneath that immaculate surface, she sensed something dangerously raw. Thank you, she whispered into the heavy air. Luca merely glanced at her. Don't thank me yet, the night isn't over. He pushed off the railing, adjusting his cuffs with quiet calm. Your sister just walked in. Arya felt the air vanish from her lungs. Shiz by the entrance, Luca murmured. Scanning the glittering crowd, she hasn't seen you yet. Arya gripped the cold metal railing. I don't know if I can do this. You can, he stated. You don't know that, she pleaded. Luca turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an unflinching absolute certainty. Watched you hold your ground against wolves who would eat you alive if they smelled weakness, Luca said, his deep voice anchoring her panic. I've watched you tell the man who broke you to walk away. You can do this. Arya swallowed hard. What if I fall apart? Then you fall apart afterward, he replied. Not now, not in front of her. She nodded slowly, gathering her fractured resolve. Okay, they walked back inside, side by side. Caroline stood by the champagne tower, laughing. She looked radiant in a pale pink dress. Pearls at her throat, stealing the room's light like a bride at a stranger's wedding. Arya felt her chest squeeze shut. Breathe, Luca commanded softly. They crossed the ballroom with deliberate steps, giving Caroline time to notice. Her gaze swept the glittering crowd, landed on her sister, and completely froze. For one agonizing second, the room held its breath. Caroline's perfect smile faltered, a brief tremor, but Arya caught it. Luca kept his steady stride, and Arya mirrored his posture. They passed within 10 feet of the betrayal, close enough to meet eyes, and close enough for Caroline to recognize the dangerous man at her sister's side. Caroline's lips parted in stunned silence. Arya offered a small, empty smile and walked on. Behind them, Caroline stood paralyzed, her glass rattling. How do you feel? Luca murmured as they neared the floor. Shaky, she confessed. You don't look it good. The orchestra swelled into a slow waltz. Couples drifted onto the floor like ghosts in a music box. Luca extended a hand. Dance with me. Arya, not very good, she admitted. Neither am I, he replied. That isn't the point. She placed her fingers in his, guided her to the center, one hand on her waist, the other cradling hers. With impossible gentleness they swayed, finding a private rhythm that ignored the orchestra. Everyone's watching, she murmured. Let them. He countered softly. Over his shoulder she saw Marcus at the bar, his jaw clenched in quiet fury. Caroline stood frozen nearby. For the first time in 3 agonizing weeks, Arya wasn't the punchline of their cruel joke in his arms. Under the blinding chandeliers, she finally felt like the victor. You're smiling, Luca noted, his voice cutting through the melody. Am I? Yeah, a real one this time. Arya met his gaze. His eyes were dark, unreadable, yet somewhere in those depths burned a quiet, protective warmth. Thank you, she said again, heavy with raw gratitude. You keep saying that, he replied. I mean it. The final chord faded into applause. Luca released her with agonizing slowness. The sudden space between them felt cold. Come on, he said. Let's get some air. They slipped past the crowd onto a secluded balcony, overlooking the shadowed gardens. The music bled away into a distant hum. Arya leaned back against the iron railing, staring up at the starless sky, bathed in the city glow. I keep waiting for the devastation to hit, she whispered into the cool night. For what to hit? He asked. The absolute betrayal, she replied. I thought I'd see them and shatter, but I feel absolutely nothing is that bad. You and I have probably both felt that terrifying numbness, when a heart simply refuses to break any further. Luca was quiet, his silhouette dark against the city lights. Maybe you've already processed it, he finally said. Or maybe I'm just empty, she fired back, or maybe you're far stronger than you think. Arya turned sharply. You don't know me. I know enough, he said, his gaze locking onto hers. I know you could have stayed hidden tonight. You could have let them win, but you stood up. That isn't numbness, Arya. That's a choice. She desperately wanted to argue. To confess her bravery was just a fragile performance. But the confession never left her throat, because maybe, just maybe, this man was right. She had chosen to face the fire. Suddenly the balcony door opened. A laughing couple stumbled out, saw Luca's cold aura, and retreated into the noise. Luca checked his watch. We've been here 2 hours. That's enough already, she asked. You've made your statement. Overstaying only dilutes the impact of your victory. Arya nodded. The truth settling in her bones, they stepped back to the ballroom, completing one final circuit. Marcus watched them leave. Caroline stared in silent defeat. Arya never once looked back at the wreckage of her past. Outside, a sleek black sedan waited in the night. She slid into the quiet leather interior. Luca following like a shadow, and the heavy door shut. The world went perfectly quiet. Arya exhaled a heavy breath been holding for 3 weeks. You did it, Luca stated, his voice softening. I did it, she whispered. How do you feel? Tired, wired, I don't know. Just empty. He looked at her gently. Maybe that's normal. The car pulled away, gliding like a phantom through the midnight streets. The toxic lights of the gala melted away in the rear view. Arya watched the towering buildings blur by. What happens now? She asked. Now you go home. You sleep. You wake up tomorrow, and you keep breathing. That's it? That's it, she turned, studying the hardened lines of his face. And what about you? Why did you actually do this? Luca leaned back into the shadows. I told you, he murmured. I know what it feels like to be underestimated. That isn't the whole story, she pressed. No, he finally admitted. It isn't. Are you going to tell me the rest? For the first time all evening, the man let his mask slip. The cold armor cracked just a fraction, revealing a profound grief beneath. Maybe, he whispered, but not tonight. The sedan drifted to a halt outside her building. She stepped onto the pavement and turned back. Luca. I meant it. Thank you, he offered a single nod. Get some sleep, Arya. The heavy door clicked shut and the car melted into the fog. Standing there on the empty sidewalk, she realized the fragile glass in her chest had turned to steel. She'd survived her own funeral. She walked into her apartment, breathing the familiar scent of stale coffee and burnt lavender, a survivor standing alive in the quiet dark. The quiet hour where the adrenaline finally leaves the blood. She dropped her clutch onto the counter and kicked off her heels. She stood still in the dark, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. Suddenly, her phone screen flared. An unknown number. You were magnificent tonight. Sleep well, Elle. She stared at the glowing letters, then placed the device face down. Her hands were violently shaking. It wasn't fear. It was the beautiful, terrifying rush of surviving the fire. Shed walked into the lion's den, faced the architects of her misery, and walked out unbroken. So why did her throat ache with unshed tears? She flipped the kitchen lights on, filled a glass with cold water, and slammed it down. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the empty room. She pressed her palms flat against the cold granite, squeezing her eyes shut. She tried to breathe the way Luca had instructed, in for 4 seconds, hold for 4, out for 4, but the counting was useless against the flood wall breaking in her chest. The tears came anyway. Scalding, violent, entirely unstoppable. They weren't born of sadness or betrayal. These are the tears that rip through you when you've worn heavy armor for far too long, and your tired soul finally gives you permission to collapse. She slid down the cabinets, hitting the floor, and completely surrendered to the storm. 10 minutes passed in the dark, maybe 15. Time ceased to exist as the agonizing weight of the past 3 weeks finally poured out. Weeping finally ran dry. She felt hollowed out, clean as if the poison had been scraped from her veins. Wiping her face, Arya fell into a dreamless void. But morning arrived cruelly early. Sunlight sliced through her blinds. Joining the aggressive vibration of her phone, she squinted at the screen. 12 missed calls, 23 texts. Her stomach plummeted. The social vultures were circling. Someone she met at a gallery 2 years ago demanding to know. Who was that dangerous man? Tell me everything. But one notification froze the blood in her veins. A message from her mother. We need to talk. Call me when you can. Arya dropped the phone onto her chest, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her mother. 'Cause the past never truly lets you rest. Caroline must have called the second Arya vanished from the gala. You and I know exactly how those phone calls go, don't we? Spinning a twisted web where the betrayer suddenly plays the crying victim. Arya didn't want to step back into that toxic swamp. But the phone violently buzzed again. Her mother's name illuminated the room. Drawing a ragged breath, Arya sat up and accepted the call. Mom, her mother's voice was sharp. It was that suffocating tone of quiet disappointment. I've been trying to reach you. I was asleep at 11 in the morning, Arya replied. It was a late night. A heavy pause filled the line. Caroline called me, her mother finally stated. Of course she did. What did she say? Arya asked. She said you were at the Whitmore Gala with Luca Darrow. Yes, I was. Back. Night owls, let's step into the quiet dark with Arya. You and I both know that heavy silence after a phone call with family. Her mother's voice had been a warning, asking if Arya knew just how dangerous this ruthless businessman really was. Men who crossed him didn't just walk away. Arya almost laughed at the hypocrisy, thinking of Marcus and his own brand of destruction. She tried to shut it down, telling her mother she couldn't do this, but the line went dead first. Tossing her phone onto the mattress, Arya didn't feel sadness. It was something much sharper slicing through her chest. Sometimes the people who should protect our peace are the ones who disturb it the most. Maybe it was pure anger, or maybe it was that bone-deep exhaustion you get when you spend your life bleeding out quietly in the corner, just to keep everyone else comfortable. She dragged herself to the shower, letting the water wash away the night, then brewed coffee so dark, it tasted like scorched earth, the kind that jolts your heart awake. Sitting at her desk, that raw heat cooled into a focused, freezing blade. Her laptop glowed with half-edited portraits of forgotten faces. She closed them without saving. The past didn't matter right now. Checking her inbox past the pointless spam, one subject line caught her eye: opportunity. The universe always knocks when you're finally ready to stop listening to the ghosts. She almost sent it straight to the trash, but some quiet instinct whispered for her to click. The message was crisp and professional, signed by Elaine Cortez, a senior editor at Prestige, a giant in the lifestyle magazine world. It praised Arya's recent work, asking for a call to discuss an upcoming editorial series. Arya read the words once, twice, a third time, letting the syllables roll around in her head. It made absolutely zero sense. Just a year ago, she had gotten a standard cold rejection from them. She knew her portfolio was solid, but it wasn't at that elite level. Not yet, anyway. We often doubt our own worth when a blessing lands in our lap, forgetting that timing is just as important as talent. Unless, and here is where the truth always creeps in, she typed Luca's name into the search bar, CEO of Devo Holdings, and right there, 3 links down, the bitter answer. He had bought a controlling stake in Presti's parent company 6 months ago. He did this. He pulled a heavy string, and suddenly doors were flying open. She was torn between furious pride and exhausted gratitude. Her phone vibrated on the desk. A text from him. Lunch at 1, I will send a car. Her immediate urge was to type a sharp refusal, to claim she didn't need any saving, but you and I have to be honest here. She let him guide her through that terrifying ballroom last night. Pride is a heavy coat, and sometimes we have to let someone help us carry it. Typed back a single word. Okay, by 1:45, a discreet, sleek car idled at her curb. The driver offered no small talk, just a silent nod as she slid into the leather seats. They ghosted through the city traffic for 20 minutes. Winding down into a forgotten neighborhood of narrow streets and ancient brick, the car stopped at a nameless restaurant, marked only by a faded number on the heavy wooden door. As she stepped out, the vehicle vanished into the mist. Inside, the air was dim and hushed. Luca sat in the far corner, a solitary figure. Watching the entrance, he stood slowly as she walked over. You came, he murmured. Taking a step toward the unknown is often the bravest thing a broken heart can do. I would, she replied. I hoped, he countered quietly. They settled into the velvet booth just as a shadow-quiet waiter left menus and vanished. Arya folded her trembling hands on the table, keeping her gaze locked on him. You got me that job, she stated. Luca didn't flinch. He merely explained, he made an introduction, but the outcome was on her. She pushed back, reminding him that owning the parent company completely shifts the power dynamic. He leaned into the shadows, his eyes scanning her face, asking if she was angry. He clarified that he didn't demand she be hired, he just demanded she be seen, because her work deserved it. Sometimes we need a stranger to see the light in us before we can believe it's there ourselves. She shook her head, the denial instinctive. You have never even seen my portfolio. But he casually mentioned, finding her outdated website that very morning, broken links and all. His voice dropped to a low rumble as he told her the truth. Her work was exceptional, she just had not been standing in the right rooms. Arya sat frozen, her eyes anchored to the unread menu, completely disarmed. When the waiter returned, Luca ordered for them both in smooth rolling Italian. She didn't fight it. Once the silence returned, he addressed the ghost hovering over the table. You are wondering why I am doing this, he said. I asked. And you never answered, she whispered. True connection begins the moment we finally demand the truth. He fell quiet, his long fingers slowly tracing the rim of his glass. 5 years ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I was engaged to a woman named Isabel. It was the kind of pristine relationship everyone admired from the outside. Arya held her breath. He told her how Isabel left him just 2 weeks before the altar, running off with his business partner of 10 years. Arya's soft apology hung in the air, but he waved it away. It was the greatest lesson of his life. It taught him that loyalty is nothing but a stage play until the fire actually comes. Most people burn, but the rare ones who don't, they are worth everything. Trust is a mirror once shattered. You only show your reflection to those who won't cut their hands holding it. Plates of delicate, fragrant pasta were set between them, but the hunger had completely left Arya. She picked up her silver fork only to set it back down. I don't understand you, she confessed, the vulnerability thick in her throat. Good, he replied. Keep it that way. They fell into a long, heavy silence. The meal was perfect, but to Arya it tasted like ash. Her mind was spinning with the image of Luca, this impenetrable fortress of a man, being shattered by someone he loved. Finally, she looked up. Do you regret letting her in? Luca paused, his dark eyes steady. He told her he only regretted trusting the wrong person. Never the act of trying itself. A heart that refuses to risk loving again is a heart that has already stopped beating. Stick with me here, because this is where the scars really show. Luca confessed that if the betrayal had not happened, he would have remained a man he deeply disliked. He stopped waiting for the world to recognize his value, and forced them to see it instead. It took time, and it took a conscious choice to be feared rather than pitied. When Arya asked if fear was truly what he wanted, he corrected her. He wanted respect. Fear was just the quickest route. As Arya looked at him, truly looked, she saw the raw, bleeding wound beneath the tailored suit. It mirrored her own perfectly. I don't want to turn into that, she whispered. Pain can either be a prison or a forge. We get to choose what kind of armor we walk away wearing. What? He asked. Hard, cold, untouchable. When she nodded, Luca assured her she wouldn't become that. The simple fact that she was terrified of turning cold proved her heart was still warm. Those who truly freeze over never stop to ask themselves if they are losing their humanity. They just embrace the ice and invent the excuses later. After the table was cleared, Arya stared at the empty space. Marcus called me this morning, she said. Her voice, shaking, left a voicemail. Luca didn't blink. He calmly validated her temptation to listen to it, but warned her that hearing his voice would only surrender precious territory in her mind to a man who no longer belonged there. Walking away means refusing to look back, even when the past calls your name. Deep down, she knew he was entirely right, yet that familiar, aching curiosity gnawed at her bones. What if he is actually apologizing? She asked, almost pleading for permission to hope. Luca's response was sharp and grounding. An apology is just words. It doesn't obligate forgiveness. And what if he wants me back? She challenged. Luca's jaw locked, a subtle storm brewing in his gaze. Do you want him back? When she quietly said no. He reminded her that Marcus' desires no longer held any power. Arya looked down at her badly chipped nails, a physical symptom of her anxiety. She confessed she couldn't stop reliving the moment she uncovered the betrayal during a family Sunday dinner. The hardest chains to break are the ones we willingly keep wrapping around our own wrists. I have probably felt that sickening drop in the stomach before. Arya painted the agonizing picture. Caroline sitting across the table, trading heavy, secret glances with Marcus. When Arya's mother made a casual joke about future grandchildren, Marcus completely froze. He didn't look at his girlfriend. He looked straight at the woman he was secretly sleeping with. Luca's eyes went dark with a dangerous fury. What did you do? He asked. Arya admitted her own tragic grace. She swallowed the bile, smiled through the rest of the dinner, and waited until they were safely behind closed doors to demand the truth, and Marcus hadn't even fought it. He just said it happened. Dignity is a quiet strength. But we must never let it become a silence that buries us alive. Arya's voice cracked in the quiet room. She explained how they acted like this betrayal just fell from the sky, a storm they had zero control over. Her ex swore he never meant to hurt her. Caroline even cried, claiming they could not help their feelings, as if that excused half a year of lies. 6 months of shared dinners, with Arya totally blind to the knife in her back. She swallowed hard, calling herself a fool. Luca leaned in. You are not a fool, he said softly. You just trusted the wrong people, you know. Sometimes the heaviest pain comes from giving our best to those who deserve it least. Arya whispered that it felt exactly the same. Luca reached across the table. For one heartbeat, she thought he might take her hand, but he stopped short. Luca tapped the table once, a gentle knock to pull her gaze back. Listen to me, he murmured. What they did says everything about who they are, and nothing about you. You did not miss the signs because you are naive. You missed them because your mind is not wired for deception. We should never apologize for having an honest heart. Arya felt her throat tighten, whispering that it did not feel like a gift. It will, he promised. An hour later, they stepped into the night. A black car waited at the curb, but Luca waved the driver away. Walk with me, he asked. They drifted down quiet, tree-lined streets, her heels clicking sharply against the old pavement. She wished she had worn softer shoes, after a long stretch of silence. Luca, tell me something, he said softly. Tell me something true, Luca said. Something you have never told a single soul. Arya let the question hang in the quiet air. I am terrified, she confessed, scared. I will slip right back into my old patterns and end up broken all over again. Luca stopped and looked right at her. That will not happen. You do not know that, she argued. Yes, I do, he replied softly. Because you are asking the question. People who repeat their mistakes just drift blindly. You are wide awake. Arya desperately wanted to believe him, but belief felt too much like hope, and hope felt like setting a trap for her own heart. They kept walking as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows on the pavement. You see, sometimes just facing our deepest fears is the very thing that keeps us from repeating the past. A dog barked in the distance. What do you get out of helping me? Arya murmured. Luca let the question breathe. When he spoke, his voice was a quiet rumble. I get to watch someone become who they are supposed to be, rather than who the world told them to be. That is rare, and it is worth paying attention to. We all need someone to see our worth when we are blinded by pain. Arya had no words, letting the silence wrap around them. They walked until twilight bled from the sky, and Luca called his driver. I will see you soon, he promised as she slid into the car. When? She asked. When you are ready. The engine purred and pulled away. She kept her eyes on the side mirror, watching his tall silhouette until he faded completely into the shadows of the cold street. That night, Arya stared at a voicemail from Marcus. You and I know that exact feeling, swearing. We will not listen, but giving in to the ghosts of our past anyway. She pressed play. His voice sounded rough, stripped of that arrogant confidence he used to parade around. Arya, it is me, he stammered. I do not know if you will listen, but I saw you. I am so sorry. I was a coward, I hurt you, and you deserved better. A heavy, suffocating pause filled the quiet room. I do not expect forgiveness, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. I just see what I lost now. I hope you are okay. The brutal reality of life is this. An apology cannot fix a shattered glass. Regret always knocks the absolute loudest when it is far too late to open the door. The message ended in dead silence. Arya deleted it and blocked his number. Healing is rarely a grand explosion. It is a quiet choice to close a heavy door. She opened her laptop and accepted a new business collaboration, hitting send before fear could stop her. Her phone buzzed instantly. A text from Luca, proud of you. How did you know? She typed, because I know you, he replied. You do not, she sent back, not yet, but I am getting there. Arya set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. She had no idea what was happening. Was this real healing, or just a beautiful distraction? Was Luca guiding her out of the dark, or was she becoming someone else entirely? Growth is always terrifying. But staying permanently broken is a tragedy we never have to accept. First time in weeks, the crushing weight in Arya's chest lifted just enough to let her breathe. That small mercy had to count for something. 2 days later, the silence of her apartment broke with a call from Elaine Cortez. Arya sat rigid at her desk, notebook open, gripping a pen until her knuckles paled. Elena's voice cut through the line, sharp and strictly business. Arya, thanks for making time. I will be direct. We are doing a 12-page spread on women, redefining success. I need a photographer who captures raw vulnerability without a single trace of weakness. Your portraits do exactly that. Arya's breath hitched. I appreciate that, she replied. The sudden, terrifying thrill of finally being recognized for her truest work was almost too much to bear. The shoot is in New York 3 weeks from now, Elaine continued. We cover your travel. You hold creative control, but final edits are mine. The rate is $15,000 for the series. Does that work? Arya's mind flatlined. 15,000. It was a number that could rewrite her entire life. Yes, she managed to say, forcing her voice to stay remarkably cool. That works. The line went dead shortly after, leaving Arya staring at her open palms. They were trembling, but not from the familiar shadows of anxiety. This was the electric, dangerous spark of genuine hope. She grabbed her phone and texted Luca. I got the job. The screen lit up almost instantly with his dark, simple reply. I know, it is a strange thing, isn't it? When the heavy ghosts of our past are suddenly replaced by the sheer, dizzying terror of a brighter tomorrow. His message arrived with heavy inevitability. Elaine called me right after. Arya frowned, typing quickly. Why would she call you? His answer carried the quiet weight of his world. Because I asked her to ensure she wasn't wasting your time. Arya felt caught between gratitude and irritation. You cannot keep managing my life, she texted. I am not managing it, Luca replied. I am opening doors. What you do inside is on you. She stared at the screen before sending a simple thank you. The typing bubbles danced before his final demand landed. Dinner tonight. Arya hesitated. Every time she stepped into his orbit, the lines blurred further. The absolute most dangerous doors she could ever walk through were the ones leading straight into his heavily guarded soul. I will pick you up at 7, Luca replied. She had 4 hours, burning half of them tearing through her closet. Old dresses piled up on the mattress. Everything felt wrong, well, too desperate or just too loud. She finally slipped into tailored black pants and a dark silk blouse, a quiet armor giving nothing away. At 7 sharp, his car idled by her curb. Luca was waiting in the shadows of the back seat. Arya slid in, feeling the heavy shift in the air. You look nice, his deep voice murmured. You say that every time, she deflected. Because it is true every time, he answered. As the driver merged into the evening traffic, Arya watched the streetlights bleed across the tinted glass. The right company can make a massive city feel totally isolated. Where are we going? She asked into the dark. Somewhere quieter, Luca replied. They drove 30 minutes, leaving the frantic city for a quiet, tree-lined suburb, miles away from their reality. The car stopped before a tiny bistro wedged beside a bookstore. Luca opened her door before the driver could shift gears. Inside, the space was warm and dimly lit, filled with mismatched chairs holding their own history. An older woman greeted Luca by name, guiding them to a secluded booth without a question. Do you come here often? Arya asked, sliding into the leather seat. Luca stared at the table for a long moment. I used to when I needed to think. Now I bring the people I do not want to perform for. He was offering a rare glimpse into his hidden sanctuary, a quiet place where his heavy, suffocating masks could finally fall. Disarmed by his vulnerability, Arya hid behind the menu, pretending to read. They ordered wine for her and whiskey for him. The food arrived in small, deliberate portions, a dinner designed to make room for truth. Tell me about New York, Luca rumbled, swirling his drink. Are you nervous? Arya set down her fork, the metal clinking loudly. I am terrified, she admitted. If I fail, it is proof I never deserved it at all. People will assume I got the job because of your influence. Luca's dark eyes locked onto hers. Entirely unbothered, let them assume. You will silence them when the work speaks for itself. Then if it is not good enough? She whispered into the quiet space between them. You see, the absolute heaviest chains we carry in this life are always the ones we quietly forge in our own doubting minds. Luca leaned back in the dim light, studying her with eyes that had seen too much. You are worried about the wrong thing, he murmured. Focus on the work, the rest is just noise. Arya blinked, the exhaustion heavy in her bones. Easy for you to say, she whispered. Do you really think this is easy for me? He shook his head. For 10 years, he confessed. He had built a reputation on fear just to survive. He admitted to making ruinous mistakes, losing money, losing people, wasting years trying to prove he belonged in rooms that never wanted him. And the tragic irony of it all, even now, standing at the top, he still felt like an outsider. You and I know that feeling, don't we? The hardest cages to break out of are the ones we build ourselves just to feel safe. Welcome back to the midnight hour. You and I have been watching. Arya carry the heavy weight of the world, haven't we? She sat there in the dim light, absorbing his words. Luca simply swirled his whiskey, staring deep into the amber liquid as if it held all the universe's answers. He told her. He just stopped waiting for permission. No more bowing to investors or old money, who thought they knew better. He trusted his own gut, even when it screamed against the grain. Sometimes you have to take the leap, because playing it safe is the fastest way to lose yourself. When he failed, he just learned faster than the cowards. The food arrived, and the tension finally melted. Arya felt a rare, fragile peace settling over her. Eventually, she asked if she could pry into his past. Luca's face shifted the moment she brought up Isabel. He did not completely build a wall, but the shadows in his eyes grew undeniably deeper. He confessed that she reached out a year later, seeking forgiveness out of nowhere. He let her speak her piece, and then he simply hung up the phone. Sometimes, people do not apologize to heal your wounds, they do it to erase their own guilt. Arya felt a cold ache in her chest, thinking of Marcus and his empty voicemails. She asked if Luca regretted shutting Isabel out. His answer was a blunt, heavy denial. He knew she only wanted him to absolve her, to say it was all fine so she could sleep peacefully at night. He refused to be the cure for the pain she caused. Arya whispered that it sounded terribly harsh. Luca admitted his choice was harsh, but the absolute truth usually is. The plates vanished into the shadows, replaced by the bitter comfort of dark coffee. Arya clung to her warm mug, desperate to anchor herself in the reality of the moment. She confessed her deep envy, recalling how he owned the room at the gala, wishing she possessed even a fraction of that armor. Luca told her she already had it, but she insisted she was only wearing a mask. The reality is, confidence is often just a masterclass in survival. Luca leaned in, his voice rough with honesty, telling her that everyone in that glittering room was faking it. Power is merely convincing the world you hold it, and then convincing yourself. Looking at him under the dim lights, he looked entirely human. For the very first time, she noticed the faint, exhausted lines mapping the corners of his dark eyes. It was a deep, soul-aching fatigue. "You only see if you truly care to look," she asked if the relentless performance ever drained his spirit. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken regrets. Finally, he admitted that he felt it every single day. The hardest lesson in life is realizing you spent years building a version of yourself that you do not even respect. To stop playing games meant facing that bitter truth, and he was not quite ready to surrender to it. His raw confession left Arya completely speechless. He finished his drink, the ice clinking loudly against the glass, and led her out into the sharp autumn air, simply asking her to walk. They drifted through the quiet streets together, letting the warm glow of yellow street lamps guide their aimless wandering. The rhythmic click of her heels filled the midnight silence. Without warning, Luca cut straight to the core of her pain. Asking about her mother and sister, "You cannot outrun your own blood forever, no matter how fast you sprint." Arya confessed her heart was torn in two. Half of her wanted to scream, to unleash every ounce of betrayal she felt, while the other half just wanted to vanish entirely. She knew her mother would never choose her over Caroline. It is a terrible thing to realize. You were never the favorite child. Caroline would just paint herself as the tragic heroine. Luca asked the painful question, would Arya truly let her do it? She felt entirely trapped, asking what other choice she possibly had left in this nightmare. Luca stopped dead in his tracks. He told her she had every choice in the world. We all write our own stories. And giving someone else the pen is a fatal mistake you cannot afford to make. She could fight, leave, or forgive, but she could not hide in the shadows while they controlled the narrative. Arya claimed she did not know how to fight back. He reminded her of the gala, how she flipped script just by standing tall. She whispered that she only survived because he was beside her. The fear of abandonment is a heavy chain. She told him she could not rely on him. Terrified he would walk away, and leave her completely broken. He promised he wouldn't, but her bruised heart doubted it. Luca looked at her with a fierce, unshakable certainty that commanded the space between them. He told her he never did anything halfway, and he certainly did not waste his time on people he did not fully believe in. When Arya finally met his gaze, the raw vulnerability in his eyes terrified her. True connection is often scarier than isolation, because it demands you to be entirely seen without your armor. She asked him what he wanted from her. His voice dropped to a low, comforting rumble. He wanted her to stop apologizing for simply taking up space, to stop fearing every misstep, and to trust her own soul the way he trusted it. It is a monumental task to unlearn a lifetime of shrinking yourself. He smiled softly, telling her she was already blooming in the dark. Pause and really feel this moment together. You and I, the air between them had shifted, growing thick with an unspoken bond. Neither was brave enough to confess. Then cold reality intruded. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, harsh and demanding. She tried to ignore it, but the buzzing persisted like a warning siren. At Luca's urging, she pulled it out, finding messages from Caroline. Her sister was begging for a conversation, wielding their shared bloodline like a weapon. The tight, breathless panic instantly returned to Arya's chest. Luca saw the fear wash over her face, his jaw clenching tightly at the sound of Caroline's name. Sometimes the people who share our DNA are the ones who know exactly where to slip the knife. He asked if she was going to answer. Memories flooded Arya's mind in a bittersweet tidal wave. She remembered the whispered secrets in the dark, the fierce loyalty of childhood, the way her sister's genuine laugh used to fill the entire room. But nostalgia is a dangerous liar when the present is toxic. Right behind those warm memories was the cold reality of the family dinner. She remembered the utter lack of shame on Caroline's face, the sickening entitlement of a girl who always got away with murder. Walking away from family is one of the bravest, and honestly, most agonizing choices a human can make. Arya whispered, a firm no. She blocked the number, powering down her phone and severing the tie. Luca offered no judgment, only a quiet, understanding nod. They found the waiting car, and she softly said it was time. He blurred past the heavy car window, a quiet wash of neon lights and dark shadows. Luca escorted her right to her door, acting as a silent guardian in the night. She tried to thank him for everything, but he brushed it off, a rare ghost of a warm smile touching his lips. Before she could disappear inside, his deep voice called her name. He told her so she was far stronger than she ever gave herself credit for. True growth begins the exact moment you finally believe in your own resilience. Unable to find the words, she simply nodded and slipped inside, The apartment felt impossibly hollow without his grounding presence. She flipped on every light to chase away the creeping loneliness. Brewing a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking, and opened her laptop. She poured her bleeding heart into a raw, desperate message to her mother. She typed out the painful truth that Caroline and Marcus did not just make a mistake. They made a calculated choice. They chose each other, day after agonizing day, for 6 entire months. She wrote that she could no longer wear the heavy mask of the perfect, forgiving daughter. Setting strict boundaries often feels like breaking hearts, but it is the absolute only way to save your own life. She explained she needed space to simply survive, warning that she might need to walk away from her mother entirely. She read the desperate plea 3 times, feeling the crushing weight of every single word, and then, with a heavy sigh, she deleted the entire thing. The time for that war had not arrived. Instead of facing the wreckage of her family, she buried her tired soul in her art. She mapped out the complex lighting and mood boards for her upcoming New York shoot, letting the creative fire burn until 2 in the morning. Throwing yourself completely into your passion is a beautiful way to avoid the sharp demons waiting in the quiet moments. The next 3 weeks dissolved into a chaotic blur of contracts and planning. Work became her ultimate sanctuary. Luca became a steady, distant comfort, sending brief texts to make sure she was eating and breathing. She found herself saving every single message, clinging to his quiet belief in her strength. But the universe has a cruel way of interrupting, just when you think you are finally safe. 2 days before her flight, her phone rang. She stared blindly at the glowing screen, every survival instinct screaming at her to let it ring. But a lingering thread of childhood hope made her answer. Her mother's voice trembled, heavy with exhaustion, begging for just a moment of her time. Arya sank onto her bed, bracing her fragile heart. Her mother choked out an apology, swearing she never knew the true, agonizing extent of the betrayal with Marcus. But an apology born from willful denial rarely heals the wound. Arya fired back, asking if the truth would have even changed anything, pointing out how her mother had spent weeks fiercely protecting Caroline. Her mother cried out that she was only trying to hold their family together. Arya delivered the final, shattering blow. The family was already dead. Then came the silence. Let's settle in, you and I, and look closely at the heavy silence that follows a long overdue apology. The words finally spilled from her mother's lips, as a desperate string of sorries for the blindness, for the questions never asked, for leaving Arya to carry the weight of the world completely alone. Arya felt her throat close up, thick with years of unspoken resentment. She didn't have a neat and tidy response, and her mother didn't expect one. Just an acknowledgement of the failure, of the profound betrayal of looking the other way. Arya whispered that she heard her, though the wounds remained wide open. A tentative invitation to Thanksgiving hung in the air, answered only by a fragile maybe. Sometimes, forgiveness isn't a sudden sunrise. It is just sitting alone in a quiet room, staring at a blank wall, waiting for the heavy ache to finally pass. Did not feel the magical relief we all secretly hope for, but the crushing weight had not grown heavier either. Let us call that progress. The day before her flight, Luca pulled her into his world. She expected a sterile fortress of glass and sharp edges, a monument to cold ambition. Instead, the building breathed with history. Exposed brick and massive windows surrendered to the sunlight, casting melancholic shadows across a room that actually felt lived in. He wrapped up a phone call, gesturing for her to take a seat. The air between them was thick with unspoken debts and quiet understanding. He slid a plain envelope across the wooden desk, a silent offering for her journey to New York. Inside was a check. A simple slip of paper, carrying far more weight than ink and numbers. We often forget that help comes from the places we least expect. $1,000. The number stared back at her, sharp and impossible. She demanded an explanation, her pride instantly throwing up walls. Luca remained steady, explaining it was for the unseen battles, the wardrobe, the gear, the peace of mind. She tried to refuse, but he cut through her defenses with blunt truth. He had watched her struggle with scratched lenses and outdated cameras for 5 long years. He knew her talent was enough to survive, but he refused to let her merely survive anymore. She promised to repay every single cent, he told her. The only repayment he wanted was her absolute brilliance, the kind of art that eclipses the man who funded it. Sometimes the hardest lesson in life is simply allowing someone to catch you. She folded the check away, and he finally smiled. That genuine smile completely transformed his face, washing away the bitter years and leaving behind someone remarkably unguarded. "You are impossible," he told her. She threw the exact same accusation right back. They lingered in a silence that had finally lost its sharp edges, settling into something like comfort. He asked if she was truly ready for the chaos waiting in New York. She thought about the agonizing transformation of the past month, the shedding of her old skin, and the terrifying prospect of becoming someone new. She admitted her fear with absolute honesty, but swore she was stepping into the fire anyway. Courage is just moving forward while terrified. As she reached the door, his deep voice caught her one last time, warning her never to let her own mind become her enemy. She nodded quietly, completely unable to trust her own voice, and stepped out into the world. The following morning found her boarding a flight to New York, her bag heavy with pristine new equipment and a contract promising a different life. There was a strange, unnameable ache lodged deep beneath her ribs, the terrifying sensation of an ending bleeding directly into a beginning. Growth always feels a little bit like grief at first. Stepping onto the city streets felt like being hit by a wave of freezing water. The relentless noise, the furious speed of millions of strangers rushing toward their own tragedies and triumphs. She had walked these avenues before, but never carrying a purpose quite this heavy. Her midtown hotel was sleek and cold, a temporary sanctuary for ghosts passing through. I want you to picture her standing there on the 11th floor, completely swallowed by the sterile white walls of that hotel room. She was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what she had agreed to. Her phone vibrated against her palm. It was Luca. Checking in from across the distance, she confessed her absolute terror to him, and he'd offered the grounding truth that fear is just the ultimate proof that you actually care. That is a lesson we all need to remember when our hands start to shake. The upcoming shoot was brutal. 8 carefully chosen subjects over 3 exhausting days. She buried her anxiety in preparation, obsessively reviewing her notes and lighting configurations until the lines blurred together. The evening slipped away into darkness before she even realized she was starving. Choked down a pathetic room service meal, forcing the dry food down before surrendering. Sleep was an impossible dream. She lay motionless on the stiff mattress, eyes locked on the ceiling, while the wail of sirens and fractured voices bled through the window. At 2 a.m, she abandoned the fight, grabbed her camera, and disappeared into the sprawling metropolis. The city breathed differently under the cover of darkness, humming with a raw, desperate energy. She walked until the pain in her feet became a rhythm, capturing the broken poetry of the streets, a soul sleeping on a grate, faded paint on abandoned glass. The tragic beauty of street lamps, weeping onto the wet asphalt. Sometimes you have to lose yourself in the absolute dark to finally find your perfect focus. She sat by the glass as the merciless night dissolved into a cold, pale morning. At 6:30, the silence shattered. It was Elaine, sharp and commanding, confirming the timeline and the arrival of the car, staring into the harsh bathroom mirror. Arya barely recognized the haunted woman looking back. She was running on pure adrenaline and fierce stubbornness, but in this ruthless world, that is often enough to survive. The studio waited in Brooklyn, a massive cavern of bare concrete and unforgiving lights. Elaine stood at the entrance like a guardian of the underworld. Dressed in immaculate black, she possessed the piercing gaze of someone who either buried enemies or framed them on a gallery wall. Their handshake was a quiet, calculated test of strength, silently weighing Arya's worth. He mentioned Luca's glowing praise with a voice betraying zero emotion. Arya tried to brush it off as bias, but Elaine countered that his instincts were rarely wrong. Pointing toward the dark studio floor, she handed over the reins. The first subject was Maya Chen, a tech titan, who clawed her way up from nothing to the Forbes 30 under 30 list. Elaine warned that Maya was heavily armored, a fortress demanding serious effort to breach. Arya spent a grueling hour, battling shadows, twisting lights and bending reflectors until the stage was set. Exactly at 9, Maya walked in. She was draped in a bespoke suit worth a small fortune, radiating an aura of impenetrable calm. True power often masks its scars behind a composed face that refuses to surrender a single secret. Maya was excruciatingly polite yet miles away, possessing the corporate skill of speaking volumes without revealing a single truth. Her handshake was a fleeting transaction. Arya guided her toward a solitary chair bathed in the melancholy wash of natural morning light. As Maya sat, she snapped into a rigid, highly controlled posture, every muscle trained for public consumption. Arya lifted her camera and fired off the first frames. The images were flawless, perfect for a glossy cover, but entirely hollow inside. Lowering her lens, Arya dared to break the script, asking the one question that Wasden approved. "Why are you really doing this?" For a fraction of a second, that pristine, unshakable smile faltered, revealing the exhausted human hiding just beneath the polished surface. With me here, because this is the exact moment the armor breaks. Arya pressed harder, pointing out the absurdity. Maya had the money, the Forbes covers, and the desperate investors. Why pretend to care about redefining success? A heavy silence filled the room before Maya let out a sharp laugh, caught off guard by the truth she admitted. Her public relations team begged her to show a human side. Arya delivered the most devastating question: does that human side even exist anymore? Maya's posture collapsed. She confessed the haunting suspicion that she had traded her very soul to build her towering empire. As Arya raised the lens once more, the untouchable executive vanished, leaving behind a woman quietly drowning in her own creation. The confession poured out like water from a cracked dam. 3 years surviving on 4 hours of sleep. A family she could barely remember. 200 lives hanging on her agonizing decisions while she stumbled blindly, praying she wouldn't drag them down with her. The shutter clicked, capturing the raw truth as it bled through her defenses. Arya asked why she refused to walk away. Maya's response was a heartbreaking echo of ambition. Stopping meant confronting the void, admitting she was absolutely nothing without the heavy crown she secretly despised. Another click. The lens caught the agonizing paradox in her distant gaze. For the next hour, Arya worked like an emotional surgeon, gently peeling away the suffocating corporate armor until she finally unearthed the fragile, beating heart buried underneath. By the time they finished, the stifling jacket was discarded. Maya's face finally reflected the deep relief of being truly seen. The remainder of the grueling day was a parade of beautiful, broken souls. A protective mother weaving miracles from her kitchen table. A shattered athlete who forged a new identity from the ruins of her dreams. A writer who endured decades of brutal rejection before tasting victory. You and I both know how heavy the invisible burdens we carry can become. Each subject walked in sealed off, terrified of their own vulnerability, and each one eventually surrendered their hidden grief to the camera. Night had fallen when the final guest departed. Arya was physically broken, her tired eyes burning, her spine aching, yet her shattered spirit felt entirely resurrected. Adrenaline faded. Elaine drifted through the shadows of the studio. She demanded the raw, unedited files by morning, stripping away any chance to hide behind digital perfection. She offered a rare compliment, admitting she doubted Arya would survive the day. Arya returned the sentiment with dry sarcasm, but Elaine did not flinch. She stated she trades in raw instinct, not empty confidence, and her instinct confirmed Luca was right all along. She vanished before Arya could process the weight of those words. Retreating to the solitude of her hotel, the real world came crashing back. The glowing screen of her phone revealed 6 ominous missed connections. 2 from the mother she was still trying to forgive, 1 from Luca, and 3 from an unknown caller lurking in the dark. She called him back, the phone feeling heavy in her hands. "How was day 1?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Exhausting, she breathed, terrified but good. That was what Luca needed to hear. He warned her Elaine would demand the raw files tomorrow morning. "Do not let it rattle you," he advised. "Too late," Arya admitted. And then Luca laughed. It was a rich, warm sound that caught her off guard. "You are going to be fine," he promised. They stayed on the line for 20 minutes, talking about how the vast city shrinks you down and swells you up all at once. By the time they hung up, her trembling had settled. The next 2 days became a blur of deeply raw conversations. "You and I both know how it goes sometimes. We just need one steady voice in the dark to remind us our footing is secure." Captured the split second between a hidden thought and a bare expression. On the 3rd day, the studio air was thick with tension. Elaine sat beside her, silently scrolling through the raw images. Click, zoom. The quiet stretched out, punishing and heavy. Finally, the woman lifted her gaze. "These are good," she murmured. "No, they are very good, better than expected." Arya felt the iron band around her ribs snap open. "Do not thank me," Elaine said, closing the laptop lid. "You did the work." Then came the offer that shifted the ground beneath her feet. A massive 3-month project exploring human legacy. Arya could only blink in stunned disbelief. True recognition never arrives with loud trumpets. It comes in the quietest rooms. The exact moment we finally see our own worth reflected back at us. "Yes," Arya stammered, her pulse hammering. "I am interested." Elaine told her to go celebrate. But Arya drifted out, wrapped in a breathless daze. She wandered the unforgiving blocks without direction, letting the concrete maze swallow her until the cold breeze of Central Park hit her face. She collapsed onto a feb bench, staring at the dark water then. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. "Congratulations," it read. Heard you killed it, Marcus. The venom in her veins spiked. He had bought a new line to creep around her walls. The urge to tear him apart over a screen burned in her fingertips. But here is the lesson we eventually learn about toxic ghosts. Engaging with them only feeds their haunting. Arya did not type an angry word. She simply deleted the ghost, powered down the device, and let the quiet win. Evening, she sought refuge in a tiny Italian spot near her hotel. It was a place with dripping and checkered tablecloths and shadows hiding lonely souls. She ordered pasta and red wine, staring at strangers rushing by outside. Halfway through her meal, a waiter slid a fresh glass of wine onto her table, nodding toward the bar. Arya turned. There was Luca. He sat 3 stools down, wearing an immaculate suit, looking like he owned the night itself. He offered a questioning raise of his glass. With a small gesture, she invited him over at meetings. He claimed smoothly, sliding into the seat opposite her. Thought I would check in a flight across the country just to check in. It is funny how far people will travel to protect what they truly care about, even when they pretend it is merely business. Feeling, he asked. Like I just survived something, she confessed. Elaine wants me for another project, I know. Luca smiled. She called me. She is impressed, which is hard to do. Arya tasted the wine. It was rich, better than her own choice. Why are you really here? She pressed. Luca fell silent. He leaned back, his dark eyes stripping away her defenses, looking into the weary soul underneath. Because I wanted to make sure you were okay, he admitted softly. And because I did not want you to be alone, after finishing something. A sudden ache seized her throat. You did not have to do that, she whispered. The hardest thing for a guarded heart is accepting that someone else wants to stand watch while you rest. They spent the meal dissecting the deep intimacy of photographing strangers. Luca shared tales of a corporate merger crumbling because 2 executives refused to breathe the same air. In return, Arya spoke of Maya. She described that fragile second when the subject's heavy armor shattered, revealing the raw humanity beneath. That is your gift, Luca murmured. You find the exact things people try to hide, compliment or observation. The truth of it hung warmly between them. Later, they wandered the restless pavements toward the blistering neon of Times Square, a chaotic sea of noise. I despise this place, Luca muttered, staring at the bright lights. Everyone here is performing a role. Arya looked at him sideways. You perform all the time, she countered. But we all do we not? We wear our heavy masks until someone safe finally gives us permission to drop them in the dark. Form behind closed doors, Luca defended, a rough edge to his baritone. Not in the street for strangers who will forget I exist in 5 minutes. Arya stopped walking and truly looked at him. Do you ever let anyone see the real version? The man who is not pretending. Luca turned, locking his gaze onto hers with devastating intensity. I am letting you see it right now. The noise of the city seemed to mute. A heavy electricity filled the gap between them. A silent question floating in the cold air. Come on, he whispered, breaking the spell. Let us get out of here. They retreated to the quiet sanctuary of a cab. Outside her hotel, Arya whispered her gratitude for his presence. Stop thanking me, he sighed. Life teaches us that when someone shows up in our darkest moments, gratitude is our only shield then. He pulled her into a solid hug. Not a polite embrace. It was an anchor, solid, radiating heat against the biting chill. Her body went rigid before she surrendered into his steady rhythm. When he stepped back, the usual coldness in Luca's eyes was gone. You did something incredible this week, he murmured. Do not let anyone strip that away from you. Not Marcus, not Elaine, not your own doubts. She promised she would not. After he vanished into the mist, Arya returned to her room. Sleep was impossible. She opened the laptop, staring at the raw files. Face after face flickered across the screen, each holding an undeniable fragment of truth. For the first time, she felt the profound weight of her own purpose. True healing begins the moment we finally acknowledge our power. But then the quiet shattered. Her phone buzzed, another message from Marcus. "No, you do not want to hear from me," the text read. "But I am sorry you deserved all." The letters burned in the dark. Arya sat motionless, absorbing the audacity of his apology. Then her fingers flew. "You are right," she typed, cold and precise. "I did deserve better. I still do. Stop contacting me." She hit send, blocked his new number, and flipped the phone over. The past was dead the next. Morning, looking down from the plane, the sprawling city looked entirely manageable. She had fled home like a wounded victim, but was returning as someone who had found her stride. Growth is rarely gentle. It is the fire we walk through to forge a new spine. Landing back home, a familiar dark sedan idled by the airport curb. Lucas' driver was waiting. She had not asked for the car. but the quiet protection finally felt right. Stepping inside, her apartment felt like a time capsule. The furniture was the same, but the woman in the hall had transformed. She showered and sat at her desk. A sudden chime broke the quiet, an email from Elaine. Attached are the final selects. Your name is in the credits next month. Well done. Arya clicked the folder with trembling hands. 12 beautiful images stared back, dripping with raw honesty. Her breath caught. She had actually done it. Right then, her phone rang. Did you see the email? Luca's deep voice asked without preamble. Just now, she whispered. I do not know what to say. You do not have to say a word, he answered softly. Just feel it. Sometimes giving ourselves permission to simply feel our own victory is the bravest step we can take. She closed her weary eyes, letting the warmth pour in. A wave of unshakable pride washed over her. She had gambled on her soul and won. Thank you, she breathed into the phone. For what? Luca asked. For believing I could do this before I knew how. His voice dropped to a gentle rumble. That is what I do. I see the potential people hide from themselves, and wait in the dark for them to catch up. They lingered on the line, the silence comfortable. They spoke of the holidays, the dread of family tables, and the question of facing her mother for Thanksgiving. What do you think I should do? She asked. Luca did not hesitate. Do whatever feels true, not what is easy, not what keeps the peace for others. But what if I do not know what that is yet? Then you sit still, he replied, and wait until you do. True clarity never arrives while we are rushing to please others. When the call ended, the silence felt safe. She stared at the faces on her screen, raw, scarred, and unflinching. They reminded her of the ghosts she was laying to rest, Marcus Caroline, her mother's apology, which could not erase the past but stood as a fragile bridge anyway. She pictured the terrified woman who walked into that gala a month ago, shattered and begging for validation. That fragile girl was a stranger now. Arya opened a blank email. Mom, she typed, her fingers steady. I am not ready to face Caroline, maybe. I never will be, but I want to see you, just the two of us. We spend so much time waiting for perfect apologies, but often drawing a firm boundary is the only closure we truly need. She clicked send, locking the choice in stone before old fears could whisper. With a slow exhale, she opened her photo files and returned to the grind. You and I know the brutal reality of moving forward. It is never a clean break. It is rarely perfect. It is just deliberate. 2 heavy days dragged by before her mother's reply lit up the screen. It was cautious, stripped of the usual drama. I would like that. Just us. I can come to you on Saturday. Arya read the words 3 times. Her tired eyes hunted for the sharp edge, the trapdoor she had been conditioned to expect. But the message offered peace. An unarmed olive branch demanding nothing in return. Okay, Saturday at 2, she typed back. The looming calendar days stretched out agonizingly slow. Healing is funny like that. It forces us to sit quietly in the waiting room until we are finally strong enough to open the heavy door. Back to the midnight hour. Tonight, you and I are going to unpack a story about the ghosts we tried to outrun. Picture Arya, drowning herself in the glow of her monitor, editing those New York photos, updating a portfolio to prove she was someone new. Luca called twice. They talked about the weather, documentaries, anything to dodge the heavy stuff she told him. She started running to kill the restlessness. Rebuilding or avoiding, Luca told her. Maybe both. And there's a simple truth for us. Listeners, sometimes staying busy is just a way to keep from falling apart. Come Friday night, she was scrubbing spotless counters and rearranging furniture until the clock bled past midnight, desperate to give her trembling hands a purpose. She collapsed onto the couch, staring into that aggressively clean apartment, searching the empty corners for some kind of feeling. Saturday rolled in, thick with gray clouds and a biting chill. Arya burned her toast, threw it out, brewed bitter coffee. She swapped outfits 3 times. She told herself it wasn't a big deal, but her racing pulse knew the truth. When 2 o'clock hit, her mother pulled up from the window. Arya watched her step out, gripping her purse like a shield. She looked incredibly fragile, aged by a heavy fatigue that sleep just cannot cure. Life teaches us that the hardest strangers to face are the ones who raised us. Arya opened the door before a single knock. Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. They stood frozen on the threshold. Her mother hesitated, then offered a quick, brittle hug, holding Arya as if afraid she'd break some invisible rule. Arya hugged back, caught in an embrace that felt deeply familiar and entirely foreign all at once. Come in, Arya breathed. Her mother stepped inside, scanning the living room like a nervous tourist. It looks nice. Different, she offered quietly. They ended up at that small kitchen table. Arya poured 2 cups of hot tea, just to give her restless hands a job, knowing neither would drink it. Thank you for coming, Arya said, Her mother gripped her mug, staring into the dark liquid like it held all the answers. The lesson here is clear sometimes. The heaviest, most painful conversations in our lives, sighs, begin with the simplest, most agonizing silence. I wasn't sure you would, Arya murmured. I wasn't either, her mother replied. A thick, heavy silence dropped over the table. Not angry, just suffocating. How have you been? Her mother finally asked. Arya mentioned her magazine shoot in New York, keeping her guard up. I heard your father saw it online, her mom said gently. He's proud of you, he just doesn't know how to say it. Those words hit Arya right in the chest, slipping past her defenses. She stared at her untouched tea. I didn't know that, she whispered. Her mother pulled a shaky breath into her lungs. I should have told you sooner, Arya. I owe you a real apology. Not that quick excuse on the phone. I failed you in life. True healing can only begin the exact moment someone is finally brave enough to say the words I was wrong. You needed me to stand up for you. I chose to keep the peace. Her mother's voice trembled. I told myself I was holding us together, but I was just dodging the pain and you paid the price. Arya's throat seized up. I've asked myself how I could watch you hurt and do nothing. I was terrified, scared of admitting Caroline crossed a line, scared of losing her, so I froze. And that is not good enough. Arya looked up, her voice a quiet ache. No, it's not. Her mother nodded slowly. I don't expect forgiveness, I just need you to know. I finally see the damage I caused. It is a hard universal lesson. Choosing a fake peace over a hard truth will always end up breaking the people you love the most. Swiped her hand across her cheek. Shocked by the wetness, she hadn't realized she was crying. Why didn't you say this before? She asked. Because I was too busy trying to force everyone back to normal, her mother admitted. But we cannot go back. I saw something horrible about myself. I taught Caroline. She could do whatever she wanted because I always buried her messes. I taught you that your heart didn't matter. Because I never put you first. I built a house where the loudest person won. Her mother's voice cracked, heavy with guilt. I did that, and I have to live with it. Arya just stared into her mother's broken eyes. Here is the bitter truth of family. The loudest demands often drown out the quietest needs, until the whole foundation finally shatters under the weight. Listen closely, because this is the turn. Arya had braced for the usual excuses and toxic deflection. Instead, she got raw, bleeding accountability. What about Caroline? Arya asked softly. Her mother's eyes turned to steel. I talked to her. She is not handling it well. Good, Arya replied. Her mother let out a tired sigh. She keeps crying that she didn't mean to hurt you. But she did. She set her mug down with a firm clink, I told her. I am done playing the middleman. If she wants to fix it, she does the work. I will never pressure you into fake forgiveness just to make holidays easier. Growth always requires this exact boundary, finally refusing to protect someone from the painful natural consequences of their own destructive choices. Deep in Arya's chest, a heavy iron knot began to unravel. You really said that? She whispered. I did, her mother confirmed. She didn't like it, but that is her problem. Outside the window, a car alarm wailed and a stranger shouted. The city kept spinning, totally blind to the quiet, heartbreaking repair work happening at this tiny table. I don't know if I can forgive her, Arya admitted, or you. Not yet, her mother nodded. I want to try with you. Eventually, Arya added, her voice trembling. But if I do this, I need to know you have my back, not the family's back, not the peace. Mine in this messy life. True loyalty means standing in the fire with the victim, rather than throwing water on the flames just to keep the neighborhood quiet. You have my word, her mother promised. Arya stared right through her. Words are easy, Mom. I know, so watch what I do, not what I say in that fragile second. Arya wanted to believe her sometimes. Just wanting to believe is enough of a foundation to start laying bricks. For the next hour, they drifted into safe waters talking about photography, book clubs, and her father finally figuring that broken porch light. It was an echo of the days before the explosion. When her mother stepped to the door, their hug lingered. The awkwardness was gone. I love you, her mother whispered. I love you, too. It wasn't a magic cure, the cracks were still visible. But as Arya collapsed back onto the couch alone, she closed her eyes and finally allowed herself to feel the pure weight of it all. She sank into the grief, the relief, and the terrifying hope that shattered pieces can be rebuilt. Her phone vibrated. It was Luca. How did it go? Better than expected, harder than I wanted, Luca replied instantly. A real apology? Good. You don't have to figure out the rest right now. Arya smiled in the quiet room. Are you busy tomorrow? She typed. I want to take you somewhere. He hated surprises, but he caved. By Sunday noon, Arya pulled up in her father's battered old sedan. Luca folded himself inside, scanning the cracked dashboard with mild horror. This is your car? He asked. Don't judge me, she said. I'm not judging, just observing. Life constantly reminds us that our greatest healers are often the ones who can make us laugh the morning after we cry. Same thing, Arya shot back. Not even close. Luca deadpan. They left the concrete city behind, drifting into a quiet countryside that felt light years away from the noise. Endless green hills and roads that snaked around without logic. Where are we going? Luca pushed, hating the lack of control you'll see. That's why I'm not telling you, she teased. He almost cracked a smile. Soon the tires crunched onto a gravel lot, next to a massive weathered barn. A faded wooden sign swung in the breeze, Westfield Art Collective. Luca stared at the rustic building. What is this? He asked. Arya killed the engine, staring ahead. A place I used to go before everything fell apart. Sometimes you must revisit who you used to be, just to figure out who you desperately need to become. Marcus, before I forgot why I even picked up a camera. She stepped out, Luca, following close behind, pushing open the heavy doors. The barn enveloped them in the rich scent of sawdust, oil paint, and dark coffee. The walls were a riot of local art, vivid paintings and photographs in mismatched frames. Behind a cluttered desk sat Ruth, a woman in her 60s, holding a battered paperback. She lowered the book, her eyes lighting up. Well, look who finally remembered where she came from. Hi, Ruth. Arya smiled. Ruth marched over, crushing Arya in an embrace that smelled of lavender and stale cigarettes. Thought you went Hollywood on me, kid. True passion never dies, it just waits patiently in the quiet, dusty places of our past until we are ready to come home. This unfold with me. Ruth turned her sharp gaze on Luca, giving him that brutal assessment only older women can pull off. And who is this? She demanded. This is Luca, Arya said. Ruth taught me everything about composition. And clearly you forgot most of it, Ruth fired back. Though a warm grin betrayed her, she extended a weathered hand, which Luca shook. Well, see about that, Ruth muttered. She glanced at Arya, her voice softening. Your stuff is still in the back corner. I never had the heart to take it down. People still ask about it. Arya's breath hitched, raw emotion gripping her chest. Really? Ruth waved them forward into the dusty light. Come on. Let me show your fancy friend the absolute magic you used to make before you got too good for us. Back to the midnight hour. Let's step into a quiet room where the past hangs in black and white. On the wall sat 6 photographs. Arya took 3 years ago. Local faces, a weary farmer, a diner waitress, a mechanic covered in grease. The kind of people you and I walk past every day, without a second glance, captured in raw honesty. Luca stood frozen in front of them. These are good, he murmured. They're old, but they hold up. Ruth just snorted from her desk, told you. But Arya had been too busy, chasing hollow city validation to see her own worth. It's funny, isn't it? Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is recognizing your own value, when you're too busy looking for someone else's applause. The barn held its breath, broken only by the groan of settling timber and the wind outside. Why did you bring me here? Luca asked, his dark eyes searching hers. Arya sighed. Because I needed you to see where I started. Back before I tried to morph into someone else, just to fit into Marcus' empty world. She had traded her soul for a seat at a table where she never belonged. Luca turned slowly. Do you know why I kept answering your calls? Why I really helped you? He asked, his voice catching. Because you reminded me of something I had buried a long time ago. We all lose our way, but the right people act as mirrors reflecting the pieces of ourselves we thought were gone forever. The work that actually leaves a mark, Luca said softly, pointing at the portraits, comes from people who haven't surrendered their souls. Yet this is you, not the fake Gallus. It is this seeing the invisible people and making them impossible to forget. Arya's throat tightened, unshed tears making it hard to breathe. I don't know if I can be this person and survive out there. Luca didn't blink. You can. You just have to stop believing that success requires soul-selling your soul an hour later. They walked out into the fading light, Ruth demanding Luca never try to change her. The drive back was wrapped in a comfortable silence, the sky bleeding into deep golds. Sometimes, the most profound support someone can give you is simply believing in the person you already are. You, Luca said, breaking the quiet hum of the engine. For what? Arya asked, keeping her eyes on the road. For letting me see all of that. Most folks just show me the shiny destination they want to reach, never the messy roots of where they started. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. Maybe they're just afraid you'll see something broken. Luca stared out the window, his voice dropping low. Yeah. But tonight I'm someone who's braver than she realizes, and who is going to be all right. Arya didn't trust her voice to reply. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the city lights swallowing them whole. She dropped him off, watching him disappear inside. Vulnerability is a terrifying gamble, but it's the only way we ever let ourselves be truly seen. Thanksgiving arrived without fanfare. Arya sat on the couch with her father, passing cold Chinese takeout while a football game murmured on the screen. He never brought up the ugly breakup with Marcus or the betrayals. He just looked at her, his eyes steady, and told her he was proud of the woman she was becoming. And you know what? That was enough. The following weeks melted into a blur of work and quiet conversations with her mother that didn't heal everything, but stopped the bleeding. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, a strange number lit up her phone. She should have let it ring. She should have blocked it to protect her peace. But curiosity is a heavy anchor, and sometimes, to truly move forward, you have to pick up the very thing that hurts you. Arya. It's Caroline. The bottom fell out of Arya's stomach. What do you want? She asked, her voice like ice. Caroline sounded impossibly small, trembling in the dark. I needed to hear your voice. I know you hate me, but I had to try and tell you I'm sorry. I finally realized what I took from you. Arya squeezed her eyes shut against the old pain. Then the truth spilled out. Caroline and Marcus were over. It was never going to work. Arya braced herself, expecting a rush of sweet vindication or karmic justice. But instead, she just felt a deep exhaustion in her bones. Sorry that happened, she said softly. Holding on to bitterness only poisons your own cup, while the other person sleeps right through the night. You don't have to be sorry, Caroline cried, her breath hitching. You were right about everything. I was selfish and cruel. I convinced myself it was okay because I thought it was love, but I was just terrified of being alone. I took the easy way out, even though it tore you to pieces. Arya sat heavily on the edge of her bed. Yeah, you did, she replied, flat but honest. Caroline didn't ask him for grace. She just needed Arya to know the guilt was eating her alive. What do you want me to say? Arya asked. Nothing, came the fragile reply. I just wanted you to know it's a hard truth, but sometimes an apology isn't about repairing the bridge. Sometimes it's just the person who burned it needing to confess they hold the matches. The silence on the line stretched out, heavy and thick. Then Caroline's voice cracked completely. I miss you. Arya's chest seized the instinct to comfort. Her former best friend warred with the heavy scar she still carried. I miss you too, Arya whispered. But that doesn't erase what you did. Caroline exhaled shakily. I know, maybe someday, but not now. After she hung up, Arya stared at the wall, letting the massive weight of the moment settle over her shoulders. It wasn't a neat closure, and it certainly wasn't forgiveness. It was just an honest acknowledgement of the damage done, and for tonight, that had to be enough. True healing doesn't arrive with a dramatic bow. It usually shows up as a quiet realization that you are finally ready to stop carrying the heavy load. She texted Luca about the call, admitting she felt a confusing mix of relief and emptiness. He replied instantly, reminding her that healing is never a straight line. Christmas rolled in with a quiet hush. Arya spent it completely alone, but for the first time, it was by choice. She stayed up late editing photos until her vision blurred, finding comfort in that gray space between being broken and being whole. Then came New Year's Eve and a sudden call from Luca. What are you doing tonight? He demanded, his deep voice crackling through the speaker. He invited her to a small dinner, with people who knew his darkest corners and stayed anyway. Surrounding yourself with folks who don't demand. A performance is the rarest, most beautiful kind of safety you can find. Arya hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Okay, she finally agreed. But if it's awful, I'm walking right out. Luca just laughed. The dinner was tucked away in a dimly lit restaurant she had never seen before. When she walked in, Luca was already there, surrounded by 5 friends, whose faces were etched with the kind of kindness you earn the hard way. They didn't pry into her past, and they didn't ask draining questions about her life. They just talked about the terrifying thrill of stepping into a completely new year blind. They folded her into their laughter like she had always belonged at that table. There is a deep, quiet magic in finding a room full of strangers who look at you without wanting anything, allowing you to just exist and catch your breath. Halfway through dessert, one of the women leaned over, her voice dropping into a whisper. Luca talks about you constantly, she said, her eyes shining in the candlelight. Arya blinked, thrown off balance. He talks about your eye for the camera. How incredibly talented you are. He never talks about people like that, so you must be pretty rare. Arya stole a glance across the table at Luca. He was caught up in a debate, hands moving emphatically, unaware of the secret being shared. When midnight struck, they all spilled onto the cold pavement, passing around cheap champagne. As the final countdown faded into the crisp air, Arya felt a rusted lock inside her chest finally click open. You don't have to be entirely put back together to start feeling like yourself again. The party started to thin, and Luca walked her slowly to her car, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. They really liked you, he murmured, breath pluming in the freezing air. Sarah asked if you were single, and told me I better find out. Arya's heart skipped a heavy beat. And are you finding out? She asked softly. Luca stopped walking. He looked at her with an intensity that felt like a quiet confession. I don't know, he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. Are you ready for me to? Arya stood frozen, tracing the chaotic lines of the past year. She was finally shedding the girl who waited for someone else to assign her value. Ask me in a few months, she smiled. Timing is everything. You can't rush the harvest when your soul is still healing. His face softened into a knowing smile. Okay, he promised, I will. He pulled her into a warm hug, and as they stood there on the dark street, something profound settled between them, not a rushed conclusion, just a mutual respect for the wait. Arya drove home through the abandoned city streets, watching fireworks fade against the black sky. She thought of Marcus, of Caroline, and of the painful shedding of the person she used to be. More than that, she thought of Luca, and the quiet truth that the best chapters often begin when you finally stop forcing the ink. Every broken promise and shattered dream just becomes a paving stone, leading you back to your own front door. As the radio crackled softly, she pulled into her driveway, ready for whatever the morning sun would bring. It was never a clean, straight line. Arya knew this deeply. Some mornings she still woke up with a quiet rage burning in her chest. She mourned the innocent version of herself who never knew betrayal. But mostly, she held on to the fact that she survived. She walked into rooms designed to erase her, and walked out with iron in her spine. She took the darkest agony of her life and turned it into fuel. 3 months later, Elaine called to say the spread was running next week. 2 days passed before the heavy envelope arrived. Arya opened the magazine like it was made of fragile glass, terrified the dream might shatter there. Stretching across 12 glossy pages were the women she had captured with her lens, raw, utterly authentic, and impossible to forget. Bottom of the first page, the quiet print read photography by Arya Vale. She stared until the ink blurred beneath her tears. With trembling fingers, she called Luca. It is here, she breathed. I know, his deep voice replied. She confessed she never could have done it without him. Luca refused to let her minimize her own fire. Yes, you could have, he told her gently. You just would have gotten there slower. A genuine laugh finally escaped her lips. He urged her to celebrate and own her victory. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop deflecting praise and simply allow ourselves to shine. Arya hung up the phone. She sat alone in the dim room for a long time, hands resting on the glossy paper, letting the beautiful reality of her survival wash over her. She drove through the quiet evening to her mother's house. When the door opened and her mother saw the magazine, tears immediately spilled over. I am so proud of you, she wept, pulling Arya inside. Later, in the pale glow of her screen, Arya posted one portrait online, not for applause but because her spirit needed to speak. Hundreds of messages poured in then. A comment appeared, like a sudden ghost. Marcus. He called the work incredible, apologizing for never seeing her talent. Arya stared at his name, the past echoing in the silent room. With a steady hand, she deleted his words, without a reply. He was right. A hard truth of this world is that sometimes you must lose everything you thought you wanted, just to discover the fierce power you always carried inside yourself. 6 months drifted by like smoke. Arya stood in a Brooklyn gallery, surrounded by her own vision. The project had finally blossomed into her first solo exhibition. Her name was painted on the wall, in letters large enough to demand respect. Luca stood close beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets. He studied a portrait of an old woman who spent 50 years building a forgotten library. You did this? He told her. Arya shook her head gently. I just opened the door, she replied. Then, she turned to face him, the atmosphere shifting. Are you ready for me to answer that question from New Year's? She asked softly. Luca's dark eyes searched hers, suddenly vulnerable. I am ready to try, she whispered into the space between them. If you are a slow, incredibly warm smile touched his lips. It was not the cold smirk he reserved for boardrooms. It was a real smile that stripped away his armor, making him look wonderfully human. Yes, he breathed. I am ready. He reached for her hand, and she let him hold it. For the first time, Arya felt truly anchored. Not because a man chose her, but because she bravely chose herself first. Love only thrives when you build your own foundation before inviting someone else in. The gallery ran for 6 weeks. Critics raved. Elaine pitched a book deal. Caroline sent a bouquet. Arya didn't throw it out. She just let the flowers sit on her counter until the petals wilted. serving as a quiet reminder that life can be agonizing and beautiful all at once. Even her mother and father attended the grand opening. Parents stood before the photographs, holding hands in a silence that spoke volumes. On the final day, Arya remained alone, in the gallery, after hours, just her, the quiet and the raw faces on the walls. She thought of the shattered woman she was a year ago. The one who believed her worth was tied to others, who nearly let betrayal define her. That fearful girl was gone forever. In her place stood someone forged in fire, not flawless, but fiercely awake. You see, the darkest tragedies are rarely the end of the book. They are simply the brutal, necessary start of a new chapter. Arya flicked off the gallery lights and stepped out into the cool night air. She had no idea what came next. But the great unknown no longer terrified her. She had finally learned the most vital truth of all. Here is the harsh truth about having a knife twisted in your back. You and I know you cannot move on from deep betrayal by trying to erase the memory. It never just washes away. You move on by evolving into someone the pain can no longer reach. You build a fortress of self-respect. Arya had done exactly that. She walked through the flames and became completely untouchable, not because her heart turned to stone, or because she locked out the world. She was untouchable because she finally realized her inherent worth was never up for debate. No tragedy and no past mistake could ever lower her value again. Standing there in the dark, breathing in the cold city air, that absolute certainty made all the difference in the world. The agony was just a ghost now. She was finally free.
Arya's story begins with deep humiliation. She is not simply betrayed by a boyfriend. She is betrayed in front of family, in a place where she should have felt safe. Marcus chooses Caroline, her own sister, and everyone expects Arya to collapse quietly. This moment could have become the end of her identity. Instead, it becomes the beginning of her transformation. One of the most important lessons from this story is that betrayal reveals the character of the betrayer, not the value of the person betrayed. Marcus and Caroline's actions say more about their selfishness, weakness, and lack of honesty than they say about Arya. For months, they lied to her, letting her believe everything was normal. That kind of betrayal can make someone question their intelligence, beauty, and worth. But Arya slowly learns that trusting the wrong people does not make her foolish. It makes her human. This lesson is deeply educational because many people blame themselves after being betrayed. They ask, why didn't I see it? Or what was wrong with me? But the real question should be, why did they choose dishonesty? Arya's healing begins when she stops carrying guilt that does not belong to her. Walking into the Whitmore Gala is not only an act of revenge, it is an act of self-reclamation. She shows up not to beg, not to explain, and not to prove she is lovable. She shows up to remind herself that she still exists. The message is powerful. Betrayal may break your trust, but it does not have the right to define your future. Your worth was never in the hands of the people who failed to see it.